We're moving on to the section on disease evolution. We talked about evolution in general. Now we're going to talk about the evolution of diseases. This is a Gahan or Gahan Wilson cartoon. And I know it's difficult to read the captions when I do this, so I'm going to read it. It just says, "John, I wish you'd stop bringing all these horrible diseases back from the city." You see, John doesn't really look that good. That, excuse me, actually works fairly well as an introduction to how a lot of diseases evolve. There are disease-causing organisms. And when these guys get into the host, sometimes it's a buddy system. Sometimes there's a certain number of them that need to get in order to kind of overwhelm the first line of defenses and set up shop. For a lot of viruses, it's unknown right now whether COVID works this way, whether you need a certain level of viral exposure to let it really kind of ramp up and cause symptoms, or even to produce enough viruses to show up on a test. Even though you may have some viruses, they may not be producing enough offspring to show up on a test. Definitely not enough offspring to invade a bunch of cells and produce symptoms. But when you are hosting a virus, when you're hosting a bacterium, when you're hosting a protozoan or other things, a parasite, you are their world. You're their ecosystem. And that means that they have to deal with you like an ecosystem. Just like if we dropped you on an island, you would need not just food and water, but you would over time need food with the right nutritional value, or you would eventually die even though you were eating. Is that these organisms have their own particular needs. And they need to be able to get at these needs. They need to be able to get the nutrients that they get from the host, which is not always the easiest thing in the world to do. And that is also why, for the most part, we don't pick up disease-causing organisms that normally would live in plants, because the whole idea of accessing resources from a plant is very different from accessing resources from an animal, which is what we are. And even the wrong animal. It's unusual for us as mammals to pick up diseases from birds. It does happen. The bird flu is one of those. But it's unusual. It's even unusual for us to pick up things from the wrong types of mammals, is we're much more likely to be compatible as an ecosystem with organisms that either live in things like us, like other primates, like monkeys and apes, or like for digestive diseases. We share a lot of similar species with pigs, because pigs are omnivores and their digestive chemistry is similar to ours. So things that can live in a pig system can live in our system, but typically things that can live in a deer system don't live in our digestive system. They're just too different. So that idea of compatibility. And if it's brand new, if it's been working okay in another living thing and it suddenly winds up being able to live in a human, it may not do this terribly well. A lot of times a new disease from a different animal, which is how they get around from one animal to another, but very often when they move into a new type of host, they are not very good at living there, and they can really muck around with the host. That happens for a lot of deadly diseases, a lot of very, very serious diseases. They are relatively new to a new host, and they just haven't worked out. Keep in mind, they're making offspring and trying to get their offspring to the next host. They don't really want to kill you real fast. They don't even want to knock you down so that you can't mingle very fast. And over time, most diseases will get milder because that's their evolution. That's their getting along with the new conditions and being able to survive and spread offspring. As part of evolution I didn't mention is that the evolution I talked about is tied to survival, survive to make babies. There's also a type of evolution that's tied to reproduction. The more successful reproducers, their features will become more common over time as well. It's called sexual selection, as opposed to the survivalist natural selection. But that's what's going on in most diseases. There are a few diseases that actually are benefited from doing stuff that kills you. Ebola is one of those, makes you bleed from all over the place, which is not good for you. But it does spread offspring. There's other ones. I'm drawing a blank on the one that, cholera. Cholera is another one that needs your kind of explosive dehydrating diarrhea in order to spread offspring effectively. One thing that's a little unusual, usually when an animal or whatever moves into a new ecosystem out in the wide, wide world, the ecosystem itself doesn't mount a defense against them. There may be a bunch of stuff that works against them, but the ecosystem itself isn't kind of programmed to try to resist them. When you're talking about disease organisms moving into a larger organism, very often there are defenses in place that they have to be able to get around. If it kills them immediately, then that's a problem. We have defenses, people think about antibodies. Antibodies are kind of a down the road defense. I'll mention them in a second. But we have a lot of upfront defenses that are pretty good at fighting off even diseases we've never been exposed to before. For instance, typically when a virus gets into us, we throw a bunch of disruptive chemicals at them. It disrupts the viruses, it disrupts the cells that the viruses are in. One of those classes of chemicals is called interferon, and one of the kind of unusual things that COVID does is that very quickly after it sets up shop in our cells, chemicals come out of the cells that say to your body, don't make interferon, just don't do it. And there is some indication that if you already have interferon out there working, you've had a viral infection recently, you've had a vaccination for a virus recently, you may have enough interferon already in place, even though they shut down the production, that it keeps them under control. There's a whole bunch of things that seem to make people resistant to the new disease. We'll talk about that in a second. Resistance is something that hosts have that works well or doesn't work well, but it's a different thing than immunity. Is that, and people use the terms wrong all the time. It's not that big a deal. Usually you know what they're talking about, but there is a difference. If I was able to keep the virus at bay right off the bat, then I was completely resistant to infection. I never really got infected. Now, I did get infected with COVID, and I had very mild symptoms. So I have some of a part of a resistance, but so it kept it from getting particularly nasty in me. I now have antibodies. Is that we've generated molecules that will attach to the next exposure of SARS-CoV coronavirus 2, and it will immediately flag them for destruction by another part of your immune system, an immune system that's kind of, you got the patrollers, but the But patrollers need to know who to go after and who to leave alone. And that's what antibodies do. But you've got to make antibodies. You don't make antibodies that quickly. So for an awful lot of diseases, by the time you've made antibodies, you better have resisted the first wave. Or you may be too dead to make antibodies. If you're a disease-causing organism, you're not going to be happy living out your life in your host and then dying when they die. The whole idea is to get offspring out to more hosts. Now, if you're very good at resisting the host's defenses, there are some things that can live in you for years and years and years and years and years, and they can be very slowly cranking out offspring and spreading them, and you may not even know they're there. And that's a pretty successful organism. It's not, in some cases, a disease organism because it doesn't technically cause a disease, or at least we're not sure it does. And there are weird Epstein-Barr viruses and other sorts of things that just live in us and pass to other people, and either don't cause symptoms or cause it so rarely that they're not really considered disease organisms. But you got to be able to do this. And as I said before, a lot of disease organisms will do something to us that will help to spread their offspring. You know, when you have a cold, coughing is not doing you any good as far as you're concerned and fighting the cold. Same thing with the flu, is that all it's doing is spreading cold and flu. And they trigger that response. Rabies was probably at some point in the distant past a disease that spread amongst animals that kind of huddled together like bats do and groomed each other, and it spread on saliva. But a rabies variant that invaded the brain and changed a violent behavior to arise where the host not only was just grooming the one next to it and spreading it amongst those animals, but would actually go out and attack and bite other animals and spread through the saliva. That was an evolutionary development, weird evolutionary development, but really opened the possibilities of new hosts, as long as they could do the same thing in the new host. So diseases do weird things sometimes when they evolve. While I'm here, just a reminder that what a vaccination does is it gives you this without giving you all of this, is that it takes the trigger that you need to build antibodies, which are marker molecules on the outside of an invader, and says, here, immune system, why don't you make some antibodies to that? And then if you ever get exposed to this disease organism, you'll flag it and you'll never get sick with it. And that's what's in vaccines. It's a combination of the molecules you make antibodies to, and very often what they call an adjuvant, which kind of boosts your immune response as a way to make sure that you do that. And they are, compared to the diseases that you're getting vaccinated for, they are way, 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 way safer. And most of them are so safe that that to say that even that there's a possibility of them not being safe almost does a disservice to the vaccine. Yeah, there are some side effects. In some cases, some very rare nasty side effects, but that's unusual. Another thing I want to talk about here is what's called the 80-20 rule. You hear people talk on the news about super spreaders. Is that a lot of times you can trace a whole bunch of cases back to a single place or a single person. And the 80-20 rule is, and it's just rough numbers, but it's an old expression. It comes up in other kinds of contexts too, so you may know of an 80-20 rule that applies somewhere else. But in the case of diseases, 80% of the new cases can be traced to only 20% of the carriers. So about 1/5 of the people that are carrying the disease are causing about 4/5 of the new diseases. for whatever reason. You know, generally, it's a combination of they spread more effectively and they're in contact with more potential hosts. But when you think about it, think about this last, these outbreaks where the people that get sick and stay home, they're not spreading it much to other people. People that are asymptomatic but could be sick and are out there, we doing all this stuff at these, house parties and such. They're spreading it to a lot more people. Let me see. Okay, one more item that I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to go on to another video about how these diseases classically have developed, and that's an idea of what's called co-evolution. Is that when you have a disease-causing organism, there's a change in conditions for both participants, for the disease-causing organism and the host. And the thing is that evolution is driven over generational time. Things that have very quick generations can change their populations, the nature of their typical individual, much faster than things whose generational time is much slower. But in the idea of this relationship, both sides will tend to change. And you will see over time a change in the typical individual that may be very subtle, but it happens in the host population as well as the disease-causing organism population. And that's going to be a big deal in the next section, where we're going to talk about how classic diseases like the flu and measles and mumps evolved and became a really big player in the age of exploration and colonization and doing very nasty things to new populations. As I first ran into this idea where the question was, we all understand that the Europeans in going across the world took some nasty diseases and almost wiped out native populations. And the question that was posed in the article is, why didn't they bring any back? Why weren't there diseases out there to come back with the European explorers and wipe out Europe? And it turns out that it's the way the diseases kind of cook. It's, again, conditions that do that. We'll cover that in the next video.